Welcome to the Ecom Logistics Podcast, your go-to for e-commerce logistics insights, trends, successes, and lessons from the leaders and innovators in our space.
I'm really curious about the pit stop as a strategy. Could you explain that in numbers? How many pit stops do you need to be able to address every market, right?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The way you can think about it is that if the incumbents network have a few national hubs and then hundreds of depots, what makes that difficult is that that's all CapEx. That's fixed assets that you need to manage in your network. The beauty of the pit stop is that it's a flexible asset light model, meaning that we can flex up and down the number of pit stops that we utilize on the day to build the most optimal and efficient route. And you can only do that if you're able to have a flexible model of utilization, right? So we pay the pit stop based on a transaction basis. For every scan in and scan out, they get paid.
Right.
That is a model that is already very common and utilized for our reverse logistics. That's how returns are actually processed today.
Right.
But nobody has thought about using those parcel shops as essentially outbound posts, which is what we do. It's not any different than how we think about utilizing them as our return
point. To the point you're making, the return side has had that model, at least over the last 5-10 years, that has been a pretty common model to say, hey, let's aggregate and then return. But return, one equation on that side is the time is not as much of an imperative. Of course, from a refund perspective, it's an imperative, but return doesn't need to be very time definite, and it can happen within a time frame.
That works in our favor, actually, in a good way, in the sense that if you think about it, our vans will go from our sort center where we consolidate all the different retailers' parcels and where we actually do the sortation to the relevant route into sacks of either moped sacks or car sacks.
Okay.
At that point, we run a middle mile operation from our sort center to the relevant pit stops that we utilize on the day. You can imagine that those sacks are then dropped off at the relevant pit stops, and the dwell time of those sacks is actually really short, because from the moment that they're dropped off, our last mile fleet can pick up within a few hours and do a delivery. That means that actually we can sweat our assets more, because we could do multiple waves into the pit stops per day, enabling the pit stop owners to make even more revenue, because they're going in and out. They're not just dwelling there for a week, occupying space without moving.
Makes sense.
That's something the pit stops owner really love, because it's in and out and it's quick return that generates high revenue for them every time they transact for that parcel or that sack.
And would you say the model goes beyond urban delivery? Because we have seen the delivery models that have evolved. It's like, okay, the long delivery models, and then there is the model for urban delivery networks where you have the density. So, how do you view the perspective like spread out? Yeah.
That's actually one of the biggest misconceptions, that people think that high density, really urban areas are easiest to operate. In essence, it's actually the hardest areas to operate. And why is that? Because you are constrained by traffic. Traffic leads to longer lead times to deliver. That costs money. The longer it takes you to be on a run per parcel, the more it costs you. Longer parking times. It's so hard to find parking in central areas, so that offsets time. Longer handover times, because instead of delivering to a residential area, you're delivering to block of flats. So going into the building and a block of flats to do the handover, you lose minutes. So all these things actually offset density. To deliver in suburban areas, we need 1/10 of the density to reap the same efficiency levels of London, which is insane. In more urban areas, we can actually see that already on the outskirts of London, where the outskirts behave more like a suburban area, because you can drive a lot faster, you can not deliver to blocks of flats. So all these things make a difference on handover times.
That's very interesting. I think something new that I learned as far as the network is concerned, because I'll be very honest, I was under the misconception that urban deliveries are it just gives you the density, and that density play from a modeling perspective. I always look at the density to say, how many deliveries can I do?
Of course.
Right? But to the points that you are making, specifically, if you're not one of the larger infrastructure where the cost of some of that parking tickets, as an example. One of the famous examples is FedEx pays millions of dollars in parking tickets just in New York City every month. It's just cost of doing business. That's not something that should be passed on to the retailer or the shipper. And for you to manage some of that, there is an inefficiency that comes through that type of environment. In this hyperlocal model, do you see yourselves more on the middle mile, last mile, and have someone else do the first mile, or do you intend to go across the board? Most services try to capture the entire end-to-end. From your focus perspective, would you rather be middle and last or do end-to-end?
So in a way, we are doing end-to-end because we take the full responsibility from showing up at the retailer's warehouse. I would say the difference in our network is that everything is managed by Relay. The only difference that from a fleet perspective, the ones that are onboarded, managed by Relay are the middle and last mile, and the first mile we use partners for, simply because we're not at the scale yet to warrant moving into our first mile. There might be the time where we do that. There might also not be a time because it won't make any sense. We're still early in the journey, so we'll see where that takes us on the first mile.
Thanks for listening to the Ecom Logistics podcast. If this episode brought you value, share it with your network and leave us a review. It really helps others discover the show and join in these conversations. And if your team is planning an event in 2025, consider partnering with Ecom Logistics podcast. We're always looking for meaningful opportunities to elevate conversations shaping logistics and e-commerce. Until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and keep leading the way forward.